On January 10, 1870, in Cleveland, Ohio, a 30-year-old businessman and his associates founded the Standard Oil Company. With an initial investment of $1 million, they began acquiring small oil companies and refineries, not just in Ohio, but beyond. By 1890, Standard Oil's value soared to an astonishing $100 million, controlling over 90% of America's oil production. When its founder eventually retired, whether remembered as good or evil, he stood as one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in American and indeed world history. His name? John D. Rockefeller, legend of the oil empire.
But who was this man who laid the foundation for such an immense empire? John Davison Rockefeller was born on July 8, 1839, in the small town of Richford, New York State. His family, the Rockefeller, had arrived in North America around 1723, immigrating from Germany's Rhine Valley to New Jersey, before eventually settling in New York State.
John D. Rockefeller's father was William, or Bill Avery Rockefeller, a traveling salesman. Bill presented himself as a botanic physician or herbal doctor, a facade for selling phony elixirs made from herbs from his mother's garden. Quack doctors like him were common in the early 19th century. But Bill was more than just a charlatan. He was a cunning con artist. He used the money from his dubious remedies to lend to poor farmers at exorbitant interest rates, with the explicit goal of seizing their property when they couldn't repay. A man of questionable character, he was later accused in court of sexual assault and violent behavior with a gun. In late 1836, while Bill Rockefeller roamed near Richford, he met and captivated Eliza Davison with his wild stories. They married in February 1837, despite Bill already being engaged to a beautiful but impoverished woman named Nancy Brown. Eliza was the youngest daughter of John Davison, a wealthy Scottish-Irish farmer living between Niles and Moravia, New York. Eliza's own mother had tragically died after taking a pill sold by a traveling doctor. Understandably, John Davison was deeply suspicious of Bill, believing he was after his family's money and was nothing more than a quack peddling unsafe remedies, just like the one that had killed his wife. After moving in with her husband, Eliza found herself living under the same roof as Nancy Brown, whom Bill had hired as a housekeeper. It soon became clear that Nancy's duties extended far beyond her job description. Over the next 2 years, Bill fathered 4 children, 2 with his wife and 2 with his concubine. Eliza gave birth to a daughter, Lucy, and a son, John, the future oil magnate, while Nancy bore 2 daughters. Though Eliza sympathized with Nancy, and they maintained a friendly relationship during Bill's long absences, the Davisons eventually forced Bill to send Nancy, along with her 2 illegitimate daughters, back to his parents. After their departure, Eliza had another son, William Jr. With her husband often away for months, Eliza managed a frugal household. When John was 3, the family moved to Moravia, 3 miles from the Davison farm. Despite his unscrupulous business methods, Bill Rockefeller did gain some respect in Moravia in the 1840s, even helping to establish the local school. Yet he considered farming beneath him, and his 2 elder sons, John and William Jr., were tasked with much of the physical labor around the Rockefeller home. John attended the school his father helped found. Though not exceptionally brilliant, he had a natural aptitude for mental arithmetic. He was a quiet, introverted boy, lacking the exuberance of his peers, but possessed immense patience. When playing chess or checkers, he would carefully consider every move, frustrating his opponents and often leading to their defeat. This habit of cool, calculated thinking was actively encouraged by his mother. John also inherited his strong Baptist faith from her, as she took her children to the local Baptist church. The 1840s marked a period of economic and territorial expansion in the United States, and John D. Rockefeller displayed an entrepreneurial spirit from a very young age. As a boy, he would buy candy by the pound from a store, divide it into smaller portions, and sell it to his siblings at a profit. At 7, he found a nest of turkey chicks in the woods, brought them home, and raised them for sale. Much of John's fascination with money was influenced by Bill, though he later recognized his father's many character flaws. In his boyhood, John saw his father as a powerful, athletic man who took his children hunting and fishing and entertained them at home with songs and violin playing. While the family endured long periods of anxiety during Bill's absences, he would return with generous gifts and plenty of cash, acquired through both fair and foul means. Among Bill's more legitimate ventures was a lumber business in Moravia, and by the age of 8 or 9, John was taught how to select good quality timber for the family. As a businessman, Bill was an aggressive bargainer and wouldn't hesitate to exploit the ignorance of potential customers. At the same time, he generally paid his employees generous wages, repaid his debts on time, and fulfilled his contractual obligations. John's own business methods in later life were similar to his father's, but he always avoided the controversy that plagued Bill. After being accused of sexual assault in 1849, Bill Rockefeller left Moravia. In the spring of 1850, the family moved to Owago, near the Pennsylvania border. It was likely around this time that John stopped idealizing his father and began to see him for who he truly was. He soon started referring to his mother as a and in adult life avoided speaking about his father altogether. In August 1852, John and his brother William enrolled in the prestigious Owago Academy. But a few months later, Bill moved the family further west to Strongsville, Ohio. In the autumn of 1853, the Rockefeller boys resumed their studies at high school in nearby Cleveland. During his school years, Rockefeller revealed himself as a fervent abolitionist, a major cause for the newly formed Republican Party. John became close friends with Mark Hanna, who would later become a powerful Republican Party boss and New York senator. John wanted to go to university, but in May 1855, on the eve of his graduation, his father abruptly told him to quit school and find a job. This unexpected news was tied to Bill Rockefeller's double life. For several years, he had maintained his traveling doctor persona in Canada, and in 1852, he met and fell in love with 17-year-old Margaret Allen from Ontario. During this courtship, Bill conveniently forgot to mention his wife and 5 children, and in June 1855, William Rockefeller bigamously married Allen. Realizing he couldn't afford to support 2 families, Bill encouraged his eldest son to find work. After a 3-month commercial college course, John began his job search in August. He meticulously listed the establishments where he wished to work, personally visiting each one to inquire if an accountant was needed. After weeks of no luck, his father offered him to join him on his travels across the country. This terrifying prospect spurred John to look even harder, and on September 26, 1855, a small merchant firm named Hewitt and Tuttle hired him as an assistant bookkeeper. For the rest of his life, he celebrated September 26 as Job Day.
The teenage John loved the work, meticulously scrutinizing every bill and invoice, accounting for every single cent to ensure his employers weren't defrauded by customers. He arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m. and often didn't return home until after 10 p.m. Upon starting at Hewitt and Tuttle, Rockefeller began tracking his personal income and expenses in a red notebook he called Ledger A. The book reveals that as soon as he started earning money, Rockefeller was giving to charity. By 1859, he was donating 10% of his income, and while he prioritized Baptist causes, he also gave money to black churches and even helped 2 African-American slaves purchase their freedom. He taught Sunday school at the Erie Street Baptist Church in Cleveland and led the congregation in singing hymns. He even used his financial acumen to save the church by raising $2,000 to pay off a creditor. Rockefeller saw no contradiction between his faith and his desire for money, crediting God for his wealth as a rich man.
Despite the economic recession of 1857, Bill Rockefeller was also earning good money and decided to build a large house in downtown Cleveland, bringing his first family under one roof for the first time in years. While Bill financed the project, John was responsible for its supervision and paying the contractors. John's success in managing the project likely convinced Bill that his son was now capable of heading the family, and Bill moved to live permanently with his second wife in Philadelphia. Though he would reappear intermittently in John's life for decades, it's ironic that this greedy father detached from his first family just as his son began his path to becoming the richest man in the world. In January 1857, after junior partner Henry Tuttle left the firm, Rockefeller was promoted to chief bookkeeper, though at an annual salary of $500, significantly less than Tuttle's $2,000. After a slight raise to $600, he began buying and selling commodities on his own account. With the salary dispute simmering, Rockefeller and his English friend Maurice B. Clark formed their own trading house in April 1858, each partner investing $2,000 of capital in the business. Rockefeller managed to save half the money, but was forced to borrow the remaining $1,000 from his father at a 10% interest rate. The partnership proved a lucrative venture, earning $4,400 in its first year and $17,000 in its second.
Rockefeller's timing was fortuitous, as the United States was about to enter an era of vast expansion and economic growth. The conclusion of the Mexican-American War and the start of the California Gold Rush in 1848 opened up the American West. Massive immigration from Europe, where overcrowding was a growing problem, swelled America's population from the 1840s onward on new steamships. In 1850, the U.S. population stood at roughly 23 million. This immense explosion in the domestic labor market and market for domestic production facilitated the rise of new businesses and wealthy individuals.
In November 1860, the 21-year-old Rockefeller voted in his first presidential election, casting his ballot for Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln. The American Civil War began in April 1861. Though Rockefeller later claimed he wished to work for the Union, he decided to remain in business to provide for his family. John and William avoided military service by paying $300 each for a substitute, but their younger brother Frank enlisted in the 7th Ohio Volunteer Infantry and was wounded twice. The disruption of north-south trade during the war proved lucrative for east-west commerce through Cleveland, and Rockefeller and his business associates reaped significant profits.
With profits from his mercantile business, Rockefeller now turned to the burgeoning oil industry. In the 1850s, America's growing economy created a demand for light that was outstripping the dwindling supply of whale oil. In 1853, while traveling through western Pennsylvania, New York lawyer George Bissell observed the indigenous Seneca population using black rock oil for medicinal purposes. The following year, he formed a company and hired Dr. Benjamin Silliman, a prominent scientist from Yale University, to investigate the potential use of rock oil for both illumination and lubrication. Silliman's research confirmed the promise of rock oil, or petroleum. But Bissell and the Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company still needed a method for extracting oil on a large scale. In 1856, Bissell conceived the idea of drilling for oil, inspired by the brine wells used for salt extraction. He dispatched Edwin Drake to Pennsylvania, and after several false starts, Drake struck oil in Titusville in August 1859. As this oil industry boom began, Clark and Rockefeller in Cleveland started handling small shipments of crude oil in 1860. When Clark's friend Samuel Andrews approached the two men seeking capital for an oil refinery, Rockefeller was enthusiastic about the prospect, while Clark was more skeptical. In 1863, Andrews, Clark, and Rockefeller, along with Clark's two brothers, formed Andrews, Clark & Co. The company began its operations, called Excelsior Oil Works, at a location over a mile from Cleveland, but crucially, it was adjacent to the railway connecting Cleveland to the Pennsylvania oil fields, which opened in November 1863. Though Clark and Rockefeller initially regarded oil as an auxiliary business to their mercantile trade, the refinery proved more profitable than the rest of the business in its first year.
Rockefeller's improving financial situation encouraged him to marry Laura Celestia Spelman, whom he had first met a decade earlier at Cleveland High School. Laura hailed from one of Cleveland's wealthiest families and possessed a commercial mind of her own. After their marriage in September 1864, the couple spent a month on their honeymoon. They had 4 daughters and 1 son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., who would inherit his father's fortune many years later. While several oil refineries sprang up in Cleveland, Rockefeller's refinery was one of the few sufficiently capitalized to weather the extreme volatility of the market. Where others saw oil as the latest get-rich-quick scheme, Rockefeller maintained a long-term view, proposing extensive borrowing for rapid expansion, believing the oil market would only grow larger over time. When the cautious Clark brothers used their majority to veto his proposals, Rockefeller prepared to break from the Clarks and secured Andrews' support. In January 1865, when Rockefeller presented plans for rapid business expansion, the Clarks threatened to dissolve the partnership. To their surprise, Rockefeller agreed, and the two sides consented to hold an auction for the company. Rockefeller had spoken to several bankers and was confident he could outbid his rivals.
Bidding started at $500 and quickly reached $60,000, then escalated to $70,000. Rockefeller began to doubt whether he could afford the deal, but after Clark bid $72,000, he immediately countered with $72,500, and Clark decided he could not go higher. That additional $500, he would later reflect, was what made John D. Rockefeller. On February 15, 1865, the new Rockefeller and Andrews partnership took over the operations of the Excelsior refinery.
Rockefeller became the senior partner, taking charge of business management, leaving the scientific and technical details to Andrews. A few weeks later, the American Civil War concluded with General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 12th. Jubilation in Cleveland was cut short by President Lincoln's assassination on the 15th, though peacetime conditions would prove lucrative for the burgeoning oil industry.
The end of the Civil War signified not only a victory for freedom over slavery, but also for industrial capitalism over agrarianism. Ohio Congressman and future President James Garfield presciently remarked, quote, "Cotton is no longer king, but oil is." In December 1865, Rockefeller established a second refinery in Cleveland called Standard Works and put his brother William in charge. This venture was the largest and most profitable of the Cleveland refineries, and the company further increased its profitability by selling various byproducts. Possessing its own barrel-making plants, shipping facilities, and railroad cars gave the company even greater control over costs. American oil quickly found its way into international markets, and in 1866, William Rockefeller set up an office in New York City to build relationships with Wall Street bankers and handle the firm's exports. Although Rockefeller took on considerable debt in his early days, he earned the trust of bankers by repaying his loans on time, which helped him secure credit in emergencies and survive crises that would have bankrupted his rivals. To pursue his expansion plans, Rockefeller brought in Henry Flagler in 1867, expanding the partnership to Rockefeller, Andrews, and Flagler. Flagler was 9 years Rockefeller's senior and had also been born in New York before moving to Ohio. The two had first met in the 1850s when Flagler worked as a grain merchant and Rockefeller served as his agent at Hewitt and Tuttle. As part of the agreement, Flagler's stepbrother, Stephen Harkness, one of Cleveland's wealthiest men, invested $100,000 of capital for a 1/3 share of the business. Soon after joining the partnership, Flagler was tasked with the firm's negotiations with the railroads. Transportation was one of the most significant costs in the refining business, and Rockefeller benefited from being close to the oil fields. Rockefeller's location in Cleveland allowed him to transport oil either by water via Lake Erie or by 3 railroads passing through the city, giving him leverage to negotiate the best freight rates. The railroads themselves were also in fierce competition with each other. The Pennsylvania Railroad was encouraging firms to relocate to the oil regions by offering lower rates to undercut the Erie and New York Central Railroads, which relied on Cleveland for transport. Jay Gould of the Erie Railroad offered Rockefeller a 75% rebate on transportation costs, while Flagler secured a large rebate with the Lake Shore Railroad, part of the New York Central network. In return, Flagler promised to deliver 60 carloads a day, a significant commitment that Rockefeller's refineries alone could not fulfill. Accordingly, Rockefeller used his position in the market to coordinate shipments from rival Cleveland firms at preferential rates. As a measure of the railroad's eagerness to finalize the deal, when Rockefeller stated he didn't have time to meet with Cornelius Vanderbilt, the 74-year-old owner of the New York Central and the wealthiest man in the country at the time, Vanderbilt famously came to meet the 29-year-old Rockefeller at his office. The Lake Shore deal had major consequences for the oil industry, as it enabled Rockefeller to consolidate his leading position in the market. By 1869, the Rockefeller Partnership was the world's largest refiner, employing 900 workers who produced 1,500 barrels of oil a day, representing 10% of world production at the time.
Soon after the Lake Shore deal, John and Laura Rockefeller moved into a brick house at 424 Euclid Avenue, nicknamed Millionaire's Row, due to the grand mansions lining its street, many owned by the newly rich from the oil and railroad industries. The Rockefeller house itself was relatively modest, as John was not interested in displaying his wealth and disliked its ostentatious display for most of his life. Notably, the later decision to establish Rockefeller Center in downtown Manhattan as a highly visible symbol of the family's wealth and power was not driven by him, but was the vision of his son and heir, John Jr., in the 1930s. In their new home on Euclid Avenue, religion continued to play a central role in the family's life, and John and Laura avoided going to the theater and opera. Instead, the 4 surviving children were encouraged to learn musical instruments and formed a quartet that regularly performed in church, which, at Rockefeller's initiative, had relocated to Euclid Avenue in 1872.
While Rockefeller had become a market leader in the refining business, the allure of black gold attracted so many players that by 1870, supply had tripled demand. This crashed kerosene prices, wiping out profit margins for many refiners. Rockefeller believed the market was unstable and the industry was being ruined by overcompetition.
To bring order out of the chaos of the American oil industry, he envisioned the industry as a large network of interconnected companies that would benefit from economies of scale to reduce costs and control oil supply and prices. Such a system, he argued, would benefit customers with lower prices while also ensuring the industry remained profitable. To realize his dream, he needed substantial capital, and Flagler suggested incorporating the company to attract outside investment. In January 1870, Rockefeller dissolved the existing partnership and incorporated the firm as the Standard Oil Company, with himself as president, William as vice president, and Flagler as secretary and treasurer. Rockefeller was the largest shareholder, with a 29% stake, while other company insiders held no more than 15%. The company's first outside investor was William's brother-in-law, Oliver B. Jennings, who had amassed a large fortune in the California gold rush and invested $100,000 for a 10% share.
Though 1870 was one of the most difficult years for the oil industry at the time, Standard managed to pay a 105% dividend by the end of its first year. In 1871, as prices continued to fall, many competitors were on the verge of bankruptcy, yet Standard remained profitable enough to pay a 40% dividend. Anticipating more market instability, Standard Oil raised an additional $2.5 million above its initial $1 million capital in January 1872 to strengthen its balance sheet. With his vast war chest, Rockefeller was ready to bring rival Cleveland refiners into the Standard Oil family.
As Rockefeller prepared to consolidate the oil industry, intense competition among the railroads was having a damaging effect on all parties. In late 1871, Rockefeller was approached with a proposal for an alliance with the Pennsylvania, Erie, and New York Central railroads. They agreed to double freight rates overnight while offering generous rebates to a select number of refiners in Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Philadelphia, who would covertly form the South Improvement Company. Standard Oil would act as a neutral arbiter, guaranteeing traffic quotas among the three lines, 45% to the Pennsylvania Railroad, with the remainder split equally between the other two. However, before the proposal could be implemented, news of the higher rates leaked in February 1872, sparking a strike among oil producers and causing significant disruption to Standard Oil's operations. Rockefeller responded by attempting to acquire an even larger share of the market. In the 3 months between December 1871 and March 1872, Standard carried out the so-called Cleveland Massacre, buying out 22 of its 26 rivals in Cleveland. Rockefeller began by targeting his most powerful rivals, knowing this would have a major psychological impact on the weaker ones.
Rockefeller's involvement in the South Improvement Company and his aggressive consolidation of the oil industry made him notorious in the press among critics, who argued he was driving all his rivals to extinction and buying up their assets at a fraction of their true value. In many cases, he would acquire refineries he considered obsolete and inefficient simply to close them down and limit market supply. After the Cleveland Massacre, Standard had the capacity to refine 10,000 barrels of oil a day, a quarter of the world's total production at the time. Many of Rockefeller's rivals were forced to sell their mansions on Euclid Avenue and harbored bitter resentment against him for the rest of their lives.
Rockefeller later justified his actions using a religious analogy, claiming he was a savior, offering his competitors a chance to board the Standard Oil Ark before a flood removed them all from business. Rockefeller also believed that his steps to stabilize the market would offer greater job security for industrial workers, rather than hiring and firing them according to boom and bust cycles. Standard's economies of scale also enabled Rockefeller to pay his workers higher wages than the industry average. In Standard's early years, he personally interviewed all job applicants and knew all his employees by name. Nevertheless, Accusations arose in the 1870s that Rockefeller was determined to acquire a monopoly over the U.S. oil industry and was abusing his market position. This was an issue that would haunt him for half a century and ultimately lead to the breakup of Standard Oil decades later.
Despite his victory in Cleveland, the railroad's commitment to uniform rates put Standard at a disadvantage compared to refiners in the oil regions further west. In response, Rockefeller formed an alliance with Pittsburgh refiners in May 1872, forming the National Refiners Association, popularly known as the Pittsburgh Plan. This association would collectively negotiate lower prices with the railroads and guarantee profits for smaller refiners in exchange for production limits. When Rockefeller struggled to sign up Western refiners, he reached out to firms in New York and Philadelphia.
In June 1873, Rockefeller abandoned the Pittsburgh Plan, believing that total control was the only way to stabilize the market. Events soon turned in his favor, as an economic crisis known as the Panic of 1873 led to a 6-year recession, during which crude oil prices plummeted below 50 cents a barrel. Rockefeller was ready to take advantage, as Standard Oil remained profitable despite operating only 2 of its 6 large refineries in Cleveland. After the failure of the Pittsburgh Plan, Rockefeller targeted the Pittsburgh and Philadelphia refiners, employing a similar tactic as in Cleveland. In the autumn of 1874, Rockefeller and Flagler met with Charles Lockhart and William G. Worden, owners of the leading refineries in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. After 6 hours of unscheduled discussions, Rockefeller invited Worden to examine Standard's books in Cleveland. When Worden realized that Standard could profitably sell kerosene at a lower price than his operating costs, he and Lockhart agreed to join Rockefeller. This deal sent shockwaves through the system, and within 2 years, only 1 independent refinery remained in Pittsburgh out of 22 existing ones. Similarly, Rockefeller expanded his footprint in New York by acquiring Charles Pratt and Company. This deal was kept secret, an arrangement Rockefeller preferred with many smaller refiners, as he understood it was better to give the impression of a competitive market to avoid political backlash. He continued acquiring refineries throughout the mid-1870s. In the process, many former critics were converted to Standard.
By his mid-30s, John D. Rockefeller was the master of the American oil industry, which meant by extension the world oil industry. While much of his success was due to his close relationships with the Erie and New York Central railroads, he often found himself in conflict with the Pennsylvania Railroad. When Pennsylvania established the Empire Transportation Company in 1873 to acquire oil pipelines, Rockefeller responded by building his own pipeline network. As Rockefeller tightened his control over the market, Empire began acquiring its own refineries. In 1877, Pennsylvania exploited a dispute between Rockefeller and producers in a new oil field in Bradford, Pennsylvania, connecting the new wells to its own pipelines. Rockefeller retaliated by diverting oil to the Erie and New York Central, forcing Pennsylvania to lay off hundreds of workers and triggering a strike. Pennsylvania's president, Tom Scott, backed down and offered to sell all the assets of Empire Transportation Company to Standard Oil for $3.4 million, including a fleet of obsolete steamships that Rockefeller had to pay for out of his own pocket because his colleagues refused to authorize the full amount. Rockefeller was generous in victory, devising a revenue-sharing plan that restored Pennsylvania's market-leading position. Standard continued to expand its pipeline network, and by 1879, it controlled almost the entire pipeline system in the country, in addition to 90% of refining capacity.
The acceleration of American economic activity and innovation during this time greatly facilitated Rockefeller and Standard Oil's immense prosperity. The railway boom reached its peak in the late 1870s and 1880s. A growing population and expanding consumer classes meant that production and consumption were constantly expanding, and oil was needed for various industrial activities.
Yet there were also challenges. In September 1882, Thomas Edison launched the Pearl Street Station in Manhattan, beginning America's electrification. While we might assume this would be a boon for petroleum companies, the American power grid for decades, well into the 20th century, was primarily powered by coal, not petroleum. In contrast, electrification rapidly reduced the demand for oil for lighting homes. Nevertheless, this was more than offset by the growing demand for Standard Oil's products in other sectors of the economy and society. For example, in the 1890s, rapid advancements were made in the development of automotive vehicles, and in the 1900s, Ford's Model T would emerge, powered by petroleum. Ships, which were enormous fuel guzzlers, would soon transition from coal to petroleum. The scale of demand was reflected in the amount of crude oil produced in the United States during this period. Around 1870, less than 5 million barrels of oil were being produced annually in the U.S. By the turn of the century, that number had increased 12-fold to nearly 60 million, and then almost doubled again by the mid-1900s with the opening of new wells in Oklahoma and Texas. Standard Oil would play a role in all of this, and John D. Rockefeller would soon be seen as the wealthiest man in the world and the first billionaire.
However, the setback with the Tidewater pipeline in the early 1880s was a sign of the growing strength of Rockefeller's opponents. Even more concerning, the Pennsylvania state government indicted him and 8 of his associates for monopolizing the oil business. These events so alarmed Rockefeller that he announced the end of railroad rebates, and the lawsuits against Standard Oil were withdrawn. This coincided with a report from the New York State Assembly's Hepburn Committee that the rebates had been illegal. However, this intervention came too late, as Standard Oil had already used them to achieve its dominant position in the market. Having lost his advantage from the railroads, Rockefeller became even more determined to confront Tidewater. Rockefeller soon discovered that Byron Benson also preferred cooperation over competition, and the two sides reached an agreement. In 1882, Rockefeller's associates acquired a minority stake in Tidewater, which enabled him to negotiate a favorable market-sharing agreement the following year.
Then, in his 40s, Rockefeller was one of the wealthiest men in the country and a figure of growing notoriety. In one of his rare interviews, he argued that, in the case of a large business like Standard Oil, irregularities were bound to occur without the knowledge of senior management, but he would intervene whenever he learned about the issue. Although Rockefeller often worked through subordinates to mask his methods, it was true that his vast business empire was becoming difficult to control. Many states prohibited companies from owning subsidiaries across state lines, so the Standard Oil empire consisted of 41 separate companies. In 1882, to address some of these problems, the company's lawyers devised the innovative solution of creating the Standard Oil Trust, in which 9 trustees, including Rockefeller, were appointed to manage the interests of the company's 37 shareholders.
Although this arrangement was not disclosed for another 6 years, the creation of the Standard Oil Trust was a major innovation in American corporate history, and companies in other industries soon followed suit until the term trust became synonymous with monopolistic power. This consolidation of the industry further shifted the center of Standard's importance eastward, and in early 1884, Rockefeller moved his family to New York City. In May 1885, the company's headquarters officially relocated from Cleveland to a new 10-story office at 26 Broadway in Manhattan. Despite moving to the country's economic capital, Rockefeller maintained a low profile, limiting his social activities to the Fifth Avenue Baptist Church. As his fame and notoriety grew, he was inundated with requests for charitable donations. Although Rockefeller was concerned about poverty in cities, he did not want to encourage dependence and was keen to ensure value for his donated money. Besides Baptist causes, he preferred to donate to educational institutions, supporting schools for women, African Americans, and Native Americans. In 1882, Rockefeller began supporting a college for black women in Atlanta, Georgia, called Spelman Seminary, later Spelman College, in honor of his in-laws who contributed alongside him. Rockefeller sought to encourage others to contribute to his favored causes with matching grants. In 1889, he offered $600,000 to establish the University of Chicago, which was founded in 1892, and he continued to donate generously to this institution for the rest of his life.
In 1892, at the age of 53, John D. Rockefeller became the richest man in the world following the death of railroad tycoon Jay Gould. With nearly $100 million to his name, Rockefeller became a prime target for journalists and political reformers who contrasted the wealth of industrialists like Rockefeller with the poverty of industrial workers. From the late 1870s, journalist Henry Demarest Lloyd began publishing articles claiming that Standard Oil had achieved a monopoly over the oil industry due to its secret agreements with the railroads. Lloyd's sources included both independent refiners who had been bought out or ruined by Standard and former Standard men whose consciences troubled them. In 1887, Congress established the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate standardized freight rates. This had little impact on Standard, which by then transported most of its oil through its pipelines. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act to outlaw monopolistic behavior. And in 1892, the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that Ohio's Standard Oil must withdraw from the trust. Rockefeller continued to operate the business as a unified entity by transforming Standard Oil of New Jersey, registered under New Jersey law, but operating from 26 Broadway, into a holding company.
In 1893, Rockefeller clashed with steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie, who was concerned about Rockefeller's iron ore investments. This dispute was easy fodder for newspaper cartoonists, but Carnegie soon made a deal with Rockefeller to buy his ore, in exchange for a promise not to make steel. In the same year, Rockefeller purchased the estate at Pocantico Hills, about 20 miles north of New York City. Pocantico became a sanctuary for Rockefeller as he began to withdraw from his business.
In 1896, Rockefeller donated to the presidential campaign of Republican candidate William McKinley, which was managed by his school friend Mark Hanna. McKinley defeated progressive Democrat William Jennings Bryan in the general election, and Rockefeller's interests seemed secure. He dedicated more time to philanthropic activities, and in 1901, he established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York, now Rockefeller University. In 1901, McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist, and his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, succeeded him. Roosevelt, coming from the progressive wing of the Republican Party, filed dozens of lawsuits against monopolistic businesses under the Sherman Antitrust Act and earned a reputation for trust-busting. Rockefeller faced renewed criticism between 1902 and 1904 after journalist Ida Tarbell published a lengthy exposé on Standard Oil for McClure's magazine. Tarbell had grown up in Titusville, where her father operated manufacturing and refining facilities, and she believed Standard had destroyed his business. She highlighted Standard's industrial espionage, price manipulation, and secret ownership structure.
While Rockefeller refused to respond publicly to Tarbell's accusations, he was privately enraged when the media began digging into his father's shady past in detail. John had known about his father's bigamy since the 1880s, but it came to light publicly after a press inquiry in 1908.
Although Standard fought back by publishing favorable books and articles, and Rockefeller tried to rehabilitate his reputation by inviting reporters to his golf course, Standard faced a growing number of lawsuits from federal and state governments, and Rockefeller often tried to evade being served with court papers. In a high-profile case in 1907, federal judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis fined Standard over $29 million on matters related to railroad rebates. Standard appealed, and the verdict was overturned the following year. In 1908, Rockefeller supported Ohio Republican William Howard Taft as Roosevelt's successor for president. Though Taft was more conservative by nature, he not only continued Roosevelt's trust-busting campaign, but expanded it. Although New Jersey had changed its laws in 1889, likely a typo suggesting an earlier date, to formalize Standard's holding company structure, a circuit court ordered the company to be broken up for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. Though Standard appealed this decision through the federal court system, the Supreme Court rejected the final appeal in May 1911, giving the trust 6 months to dissolve.
At the time of the dissolution, Standard controlled 14% of the crude oil supply and 70% of the refined oil market. Rockefeller formally retired as president of Standard Oil of New Jersey, which was the largest single entity held by the Rockefeller family. Standard shareholders received similar stakes in the 34 independent companies that emerged from the breaking of the monopoly, including corporations like Conoco, Chevron, Exxon, and Mobil. This breakup created an opportunity for the American public to buy Standard shares for the first time, causing stock prices to skyrocket, which, by 1916, made Rockefeller the world's first billionaire. Flush with cash, Rockefeller proposed the creation of the Rockefeller Foundation, which was chartered by New York in 1913. Rockefeller contributed a total of $183 million to the Rockefeller Foundation, primarily focusing on supporting health and various medical schools around the world.
Over time, Rockefeller donated much of his wealth to his children, particularly John Jr., who was already assisting his father in managing his investments and serving as president of the Rockefeller Foundation. The younger Rockefeller resigned from Standard's board in 1910 amid a bribery scandal involving Archbold and dedicated most of his time to philanthropic activities. However, John Jr. was responsible for one of the family's darkest moments as a director of the Colorado Fuel and Iron, where his father retained a controlling stake. When the United Mine Workers went on strike in 1913 over poor working conditions, Jr. supported the company's efforts to break the strike. In April 1914, Colorado National Guardsmen and private guards hired by the company attacked the strikers, killing over 20 men, women, and children. Although Jr.'s actions against the strikers had his father's full support, Jr. realized the public damage to the family and used Rockefeller Foundation funds to support the miners' families. This event became infamous as the Ludlow Massacre.
After the United States entered World War I in 1917, Rockefeller's public image improved as he purchased war bonds and supported Allied causes through his philanthropic foundations. He noted the irony of governments around the world encouraging oil companies to work together to supply fuel for military vehicles.
In 1918, Rockefeller purchased a winter home called The Casements in Ormond Beach, Florida. This house was opposite the Ormond Hotel, which had been built by his former business partner, Henry Flagler, who had moved to Florida in the 1880s and died in 1913. The relationship between the two men had broken down after Flagler divorced his second wife to marry a much younger woman, and Rockefeller only began visiting the area after Flagler's death. For the remaining 2 decades of his life, Rockefeller was passionate about social and religious causes. He was pleased when alcohol was prohibited with the passing of the 18th Amendment in 1920. However, after a flourishing black market emerged as a result, Rockefeller did not object to its repeal in 1933, realizing that prohibition had created more problems than it solved. In retirement, Rockefeller continued to invest in the stock market and lost almost half of his remaining wealth during the Wall Street crash in October and November 1929.
Despite his reputation for secretiveness and being reserved as a businessman, Rockefeller was a cheerful old man in his 80s and 90s, aspiring to live to 100. He fell short of his goal by only a few weeks, passing away on the morning of May 23, 1937, just shy of his 98th birthday. His body was transported by train from the Casements to Pocantico for a funeral service, during which all the old Standard companies worldwide stopped work for 5 minutes of silence. After the service, his remains were transferred to Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, where he was laid to rest beside his mother and wife. A 70-foot-tall obelisk, America's largest funerary monument at the time, was erected there.
John Davidson Rockefeller was a colossal figure of American industrial capitalism and truly embodied America's Gilded Age in the late 19th century. Influenced in various ways by his mother's Baptist faith and his father's often questionable money-making schemes, Rockefeller amassed one of history's greatest fortunes by creating a monopoly out of America's emerging oil industry. While his critics attacked him for dishonest business practices and secret arrangements that gave him an unfair advantage over his rivals, Rockefeller justified his actions by arguing that these were necessary tactics to save the oil industry from destroying itself through internal competition. He never managed to create a full monopoly, and his market dominance was gradually eroded by international competition and governmental intervention domestically. After withdrawing from Standard in the 1890s, Rockefeller undertook significant philanthropic projects, and the University of Chicago, Rockefeller University, and the Rockefeller Foundation continued to thrive in their respective fields more than a century later.